Hello, and welcome to the Skillful Podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Marielle Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. So, Ed, welcome. I'm excited to be talking about Check the Facts today.
Yes, this is such a great skill. And I always kind of laugh because, the skill is in the name. Like basically checking the facts is what you do. And we can give a lot more details about what that means.
Yes.
But nonetheless, it's a really valuable skill for emotion regulation to be able to when we talk about it in group, for me, I'm always reminded that when emotions are high, we want to balance that out with more of our reasonable mind, which is more focused on facts and those kinds of things in order to achieve that wise mind balance. So check the facts is something that we can do when emotions seem kind of high to kind of balance it out a little bit, get to the middle to determine how do I act on these emotions.
Yes. And so just to give a little framework for where we are with this skill, Check the Facts is one of three primary skills that we use to help change painful emotions. And we also teach skills that help you reduce your vulnerability to those painful emotions in the first place. We teach mindfulness skills around emotions, but we have these three core skills, Check the Facts being the first one that we're talking about today, that help you change the emotions that you want to change that are causing you suffering.
And I think a point that we try to really emphasize is that when we're looking at changing emotions, we are changing them because they are causing some pain for us and because we want to change them, not because someone told us we should change them or we assume people think we should change them or any of that. It's really like, I don't like feeling this way and I would like to change it. What are my options?
Yes. And that's such an important distinction because it's not going to be useful to use a skill if it's an emotion that someone else, you should stop feeling so sad or needy or whatever someone might have told you who's close to you.
Right.
It has to be something that that you want to change because it's getting in the way of living the life that you want to live.
Exactly. And I think that with the idea of starting, if we want to change an emotion, starting with checking the facts is really important because as we've talked about before, emotions give us information. They communicate to us, they communicate to others, they motivate us towards action. So emotions serve a purpose. And sometimes we have emotions that we don't really like and we would like to change. And before we try to change those emotions, we want to know what we're dealing with and be more factual about it. So checking the facts of the situation that may be leading to the emotion.
Yeah.
To kind of like see what's really going on here before we decide what we want to do.
Yeah, because often our strong negative or painful emotions aren't really about the actual facts of a situation. Often they can be set off by our thoughts or our interpretations of the event rather than the actual event itself. And I can give an example here. I remember a while back, I was in the grocery store one morning and I ran into a friend, someone I'm not that close to, but who's part of my friend's group. And I was chatting with this friend in the store and mentioned that my significant other was out of town. And then we said goodbye and went on our way. And she called me a short while later and she said, "Oh, the Academy Awards are tonight. We're having a party. Would you like to come?" And I told her I wanted to think about it because I was sort of planning my day and I would let her know. But really, I had all these emotions when she called and invited me. I had immediately a bunch of stories came in my mind. Like, oh, I kind of knew that her significant other didn't like my significant other. And here's proof. But now my partner's out of town and I'm getting invited to this party. Like it was just like I went wild in my head. And I came back to the skill and I was like, okay, what are the facts, Marielle? So the facts were, and I kind of went through them. I ran into the store. She invited me to this party or get together. I was having emotions about it. So that was, kind of acknowledging to myself, but I didn't have any facts to really substantiate this whole story that was causing me a lot of pain and was going to lead me to say no to this gathering that I actually thought was going to be fun.
Right. And I think that that's such a good example of how something happens and we can have an emotional reaction pretty quickly and not necessarily notice that our thoughts are influencing that emotional reaction. Our beliefs are influencing that reaction. Our interpretations of whatever the event is are influencing the emotional reaction. Sometimes we can have something happen, have an emotional reaction, and then create thoughts to justify that emotion.
Mm-hmm.
The thoughts that seem like facts are actually just coming after we've already had an emotional reaction. So that's checking to see, wait, hold on, I'm feeling this emotion. What's going on here? What are the actual facts of the situation? It's something concrete, not my interpretations, not my assumptions, not my judgments, but what are the facts of the situation? And start with that. And in DBT language, what we want to do is we want to look to see, is the emotion that I'm having right now justified by the facts? So, do the facts of this situation justify the emotion that I'm having? Or perhaps is the emotion based in assumptions or past experiences or reactions that are not justified by the facts? In which case, trying to manage that emotion is going to have a very different outcome than if I'm really basing it in what are the facts of the situation, what emotion goes with that.
Yes. And I think this skill also is, or as we're talking about the skill, I'm thinking back to our episode on myths about emotions.
Mhm.
And I can't remember exactly how we worded this myth, but it was a myth or maybe a couple myths around like it's inauthentic to change my emotions, or myths that have to go to like my emotions are should always be trusted, or
Right.
somehow it's wrong to want to shift or change our emotions.
Right. And I think that this skill of checking the facts reminds us that we can very often have emotions that are not based in facts.
Yes.
And if that's the case, then we want to align our emotions with the facts of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we might need to change that emotion in order to get in line with the facts.
Yeah. And sometimes going through the process of checking the facts, and we'll talk about how to actually do it because there's several different steps. Doing that just in and of itself can bring down the emotion, tenfold.
Right. So if I'm having a really strong emotion, taking a step back and checking the facts of the situation sometimes can help to just simply be like, oh, I am feeling really angry because I'm assuming what that other person is thinking and I have no idea what they're thinking.
Right.
Let me slow that down.
Yeah. So let's start leading listeners through all the different steps and how you actually do it. Because as you said in the beginning, like what the skill is, or the name of the skill is what you do, but it's more nuanced than
Right.
just checking the facts. So there's a process that can help guide you through it.
Right. So, and I think that looking at checking the facts, the place to start is to name the emotion that you're having that you want to change. So to start with, what emotion am I having? And so often when we do this with people, they will say, I'm just feeling bad. Well, but what kind of bad? Are you feeling angry? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling scared? Like, what exactly is the emotion? So naming the emotion is the most helpful starting place and a way to like start checking the facts. What specific emotion is this? Not just I feel bad or I don't like how I feel, but I am feeling angry or whatever it might be.
Yeah. And even doing that small step when you go from I'm just feeling bad or crappy or down or whatever language you might use, and actually labeling it, saying what the emotion actually is. Oh, I'm angry, or I'm feeling shame. Just doing that can be calming.
Right. Yeah, for me, it helps a lot to just be like, hold on, what am I feeling? Oh, I feel scared. Okay.
Yeah.
Instead of, oh my God, I feel overwhelmed. I think we all kind of have like an automatic story we tell ourselves. So sometimes, like for me, I'll say, oh, I feel overwhelmed. What does that mean? Like,
Hmm.
oh, I feel scared, or oh, I feel angry. And so I know plenty of people who say, I feel bad, or I don't feel good. But like naming the actual emotion that we're having gives us information just right off the bat.
Yeah. Okay. And then the next step with checking the facts, once you've named your emotion, is to ask, what is the event that is prompting my emotion? So, what is the thing that happened that brought the emotion on? And this can be something that's external, like out in your world. So, with this example I gave of running into an acquaintance at the grocery store and asking me to this party when she learned that my spouse was out of town, that was external. It can also be internal, where the prompting event is a thought you had or a memory, or maybe you smelled something that evoked a memory or a sensation in your body.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about in DBT is that everything has a cause. Like things don't come out of nowhere. Oftentimes we don't know what that cause is. So when we're having an emotion, there is something that prompted it. Honestly, we cannot always pinpoint what prompted this emotion. For instance, if I smell something and have an automatic reaction to that and can't really put together that that smell reminded me of something from the past that created this emotional reaction, we can't always do that. Oftentimes we can. We can see, oh, when this person said this, this is what prompted the emotion. Or when I had this feeling in my body, this is what prompted the fear, or whatever it might be. So being able to like say what exactly prompted my emotion and to try to be as non-judgmental as possible, a skill that we've talked about before. Just, like what did I experience with my senses? What is the who, what, when, and where of the situation? So that we can just be as factual as possible, trying to put our assumptions, judgments, interpretations to the side.
Hmm. And so, some examples of describing the event that prompted your emotion that is not just about the facts. Suppose you're waiting from a phone call from your boyfriend. You haven't heard from him. And so you're saying, okay, the emotion I'm feeling is anger. They said they were going to call, they haven't called. Okay, I'm going through check the facts. What is the prompting event? Well, they're a jerk, clearly, because they say they're going to call and they didn't call. So that is maybe like a very obvious one. That is not actually factual. That's not actually the event. The event is I didn't get the call.
I've done this with people enough times to have them say, no, it is a fact that he is a jerk.
Right.
Okay, well.
Which doesn't mean, because we get to discern, like there are people in our lives who might be better for us to not be close to.
Right. Again, if someone habitually says that they will call and they don't, then, that is something to keep in mind.
Yes.
Labeling it as a jerk, it will increase emotions. It's not always actually helpful.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean like, oh, I have to have this person in my life all the time. It's just, they said they would call, they didn't call.
Yes. And for people who are prone to really strong emotions or people who are emotionally sensitive, saying, well, he's a jerk, clearly, that's the event that got me so upset. It doesn't allow for nuance. It goes into more of this black and white thinking. So maybe he's acting in a way that's kind of like a jerk now, but it erases all the other times that wasn't the case.
Right. And so when we are checking the facts, we name our emotion, we try to, as non-judgmentally as possible, identify what was the event prompting the emotion. And then the third step is to actually dig into those interpretations, because they're there almost always. There's some level of interpretation or assumption that is going into this. And so naming those. So here are the facts of the situation that prompted the emotion. Here are my interpretations, my judgments, my thoughts, my assumptions that will contribute to this emotion.
So just going back to the story I told in the beginning with the friend who invited me to this party to watch the Academy Awards, my interpretations and assumptions had to do with them not really liking, as I said, my significant other. I think there was old stuff around being excluded from my family of origin that came up. I had a whole story around, oh, all my friends are getting together every year to watch this award ceremony and I'm never invited. And see, they don't really like me. I mean, there was, I went in all these different ways. My mind told me a whole bunch of different stories that were painful.
Right. And I think in the process of checking the facts, taking that step back and being able to identify, here are all the stories my mind is telling me, so that we can own it and name it and to sort out, okay, these are the facts of the situation. I got invited to a party, period, right? Here's all the layers that I'm adding on top of that. And I don't know for sure. Like, yes, I have experiences from my past that influence this. I can't say for sure that these things I'm assuming are what motivated the person to invite me to the party.
Yes.
And so being able to name that. And then I think another level that we can add is, what are some other possible interpretations? So yes, I'm having these interpretations, these judgments of whatever happened. What are some other possibilities, right? Because whatever we're assuming without facts, there's other options as well that we sometimes are screening out that could balance out the intensity of that emotion.
Yes. What this step does is it really helps us look at the situation from all these different angles. And for a lot of folks who are emotionally dysregulated, we can get this kind of tunnel vision. And it's so hard to think more broadly and think about different points of view and different factors. And we just pay attention to the information that supports the painful story we're telling ourselves.
Right. And so this process of checking the facts, of naming the emotion, naming what prompted the emotion, and then looking at our interpretations and other possibilities, that is like slowing down that intensity and giving us a chance to actually access that wise mind. So bringing our suds down and access our wise mind about what's happening here, rather than, I have this thing happen, strong emotion, and then I'm just in that emotion.
Yeah.
Checking the facts slows it down. And then we're able to like see things a little more clearly than if we're just in that strong emotion.
Yes. And so when I was in that painful place with that friend who invited me to the party, I, in last minute, or at least in my mind, was telling me I wasn't really wanted because I was not considered when the initial planning happened. I was not able in that moment, until I started walking myself through the skill, to think about, like a more positive interpretation, that I ran into this friend in the grocery store and she said, oh yeah, it would be really nice to have Marielle come tonight.
Right. And again, like slowing down, we are able to see these other sides of the possibilities.
Yeah.
And as you're describing the story, the person invited you, it sounds more likely that, it would be nice to have Marielle, than, we don't ever want to invite her.
Right.
It's an afterthought to invite her and we don't even like her. And
and I was like, they feel bad for me because I'm alone tonight. This is a pity invite. It went all over.
Right.
Yeah.
And from the outside, it's like, probably sounds like we're like, that would be cool to have her. But when we're in the emotion, we don't see that. Checking the facts allows us to see those other possibilities and maybe embrace that perspective.
And then this is so interesting about the skill, and which this piece can get lost when people just hear check the facts. I mean, you kind of get a sense of what it's about. But what the skill asks you to do is to do a couple things. And the first one is to ask, what's the threat? Because many times when we have a very strong negative emotion and it's sort of immovable, even when we check the facts, underneath it is something that feels threatening or scary.
Yeah, I think definitely if there is an emotion that is really strong and hard to change, there's usually some threat attached to it. We're trying to protect ourselves in some way, which is a very human response. And we are programmed to be able to do this, to protect ourselves from threats. So often when we're talking about checking the facts, doing those first 3 steps of naming the emotion, what prompted the emotion, what are my interpretations and other possibilities, If that's not enough to bring the emotion down, then probably there is some threat involved. And naming, what's the threat? What am I worried about here?
Yes.
What's the threat to me that I'm assuming? And name it.
Yes. Name it. And so with this story, again, I feel like the threat for me in that moment was, I'm not wanted.
Right.
Yeah. Or I'm going to be ostracized in some way, which leads us to the next step where you try to label what the underlying threat or fear is. And then the skill asks you to really kind of go there. Like, what's the catastrophe? What's the thing you're most worried about happening? And really labeling it and imagine it really happening. So this is a tricky part of the skill.
And I think it is like what is needed to bring the intensity of emotion down is rather than feeling some sort of threat and assuming the worst in some way and trying to push that away, that's not going to work, right? So we name the threat, we name the worst that could happen, and we think about if the worst happened, how would I cope?
Mm-hmm.
Because so often when we're stuck with painful emotions, it's because we are assuming a threat that's probably too big, and we are minimizing our ability to cope with that threat,
Yes.
which is probably greater than we're giving ourselves credit for. So with checking the facts, if we can't get this emotion to move, then what is the threat? What's the worst that could happen? What's the catastrophe? And if that happens, how will I cope?
Yeah.
So that it's not so unknown of like, oh my gosh, I'll never be invited to any other events again.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm never invited, how will I cope?
Yes. And coming up with different ways to cope. So it could be problem solving, radical acceptance, all sorts of different things that we can do to cope with the things that we are really scared of.
Right. And so, as we're going, check the facts is really a way to notice unwanted emotions and make an effort to change them. And just going through this process can make a big difference, right? Just naming the emotion can help. Just getting to the facts of what happened that prompted the emotion. Being able to look at what are my interpretations? Are there other possibilities I'm not considering? Is there a threat? And if that threat came true, how would I deal with it? And oftentimes that process is enough to be like, okay, maybe it's not automatic that no one wanted to invite me to this thing and no one cares about me and they don't like me and they feel sorry for me and they don't like my partner and all of this kind of stuff. But, even if all of that is true, I'll deal with it.
Right. Right. Which can feel really empowering.
Right. And less threatening. The intensity of emotion will come down.
And then the last thing to ask yourself, or the last step of this skill, is to inquire, does the emotion and or its intensity fit the actual facts? So when we're talking about check the facts, it's not just does our emotion fit the facts or is our emotion justified by the facts? We also want to think about how strong the emotion is and how long it lasts. So if someone cuts me off in traffic, anger would fit the facts. And probably fear, something dangerous that has just happened. I feel threatened in some way. But if I'm still feeling angry hours later, or we might even say in a rage, so the intensity is really high and it's lasting for hours, then the emotion doesn't fit the facts.
Sometimes our emotion actually doesn't fit the facts, right? I got cut off in traffic and I feel really sad. Okay, what's going on there? Because getting cut off in traffic doesn't necessarily lead to sadness. Probably something it reminds me of, whatever, right? So sometimes the emotion actually doesn't fit the facts of the situation. Sometimes the emotion does fit the facts, like I'm angry at getting cut off, but the intensity, rage, doesn't fit the facts because I got cut off, but I didn't get into an accident. I went on my way. The other person went on their way. Yes, that's dangerous and we're all okay. Rage doesn't necessarily fit the facts. If I am angry days later, if every time I get behind the wheel, I'm angry about that person who cut me off, right? Then that doesn't actually fit the facts of the situation. So sometimes the intensity or the duration will be not really fit. And that's where we want to look at options for changing that emotion.
And so we've gone through all the different steps of how you actually check the facts. And let's talk about another example or two. So, Ed, tell me about a painful emotion you had recently that you want to check the facts about.
Well, it's interesting because when you brought up the whole driving thing, many of my painful emotions happen either while driving or while being a passenger. And with my husband, like we both think that the other person is a bad driver, which is full of judgment. Mine, of course, are correct. But
Of course.
I have to make sure that he doesn't listen to this particular episode. So very often what will happen is like he'll be driving and I will have all sorts of judgments about how he's driving and get really angry that he's doing the wrong thing. Like he's not, he should be going faster. He should be going slower. He should be signaling more. He should be signaling less. Whatever he's doing, I have all these judgments that make me angry.
Okay. So the emotion you want to change is anger.
Yes.
What's the prompting event? Or I mean, you kind of name them, but like say more about the thing that happens that makes you feel angry, that and just sticking to the facts.
Just the facts.
Yes.
He is driving and I am not.
Gosh, so like really just strip bare of all the other stuff you said a moment ago.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's it.
So, and that's such a tricky, and I can certainly relate to this. That's such a tricky one. You're removing the like, he's not driving right. He's too fast. He's too slow. He's reckless, whatever.
Right.
Okay. The
Yeah,
fact
he is driving and I am not.
And you're not. What are the interpretations, thoughts, and assumptions about the fact that he's driving and you're not?
He's doing it wrong.
Right.
Like that. And again, this happens a lot. And where it's like whatever he's doing, he could be going too fast, could be going too slow. Whatever he is doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a look at that and breaking it down, it's like he's driving and I'm not in control. And so I may be having a reaction to being out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a possible interpretation as opposed to he's doing it wrong.
Right. Yes.
Like I am reacting to being out of control.
So you're trying to look at it from a different point of view.
Right. Yeah. So like I have judgments like, yeah, he's doing it wrong, too fast, too slow, whatever. And there's other possibilities like, he's driving the way he drives. It's different than me. He is driving and I'm not in control. And so I'm, feeling anxious about not having control over where the car is going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then related to that, let's go into the next question we ask. Are you assuming a threat?
Yeah. Slowing it down, it's like, oh, wow, I'm assuming that there will be an accident because he did it wrong.
Yes. And so what this asks you to do is kind of assess the probability that this thing will occur and to think of other possible outcomes as well.
So we have been driving together for many years and never had an accident together. So the probability is very low. Actually, I need to put this in here. He is a very cautious driver. And so I have had accidents. He never has. Mm-hmm. So, so the chance of him having an accident are really low. The probability is very low. Much more likely that there will not be an accident.
Mm-hmm. And then what's the catastrophe? Like, what's the thing you most fear? Is it the accident?
Yeah, that there will be a really bad accident.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing is that I complain a lot when he's driving, but if there ever was an accident, I would immediately be like, like this was an accident. It's not your fault. Accidents happen. You're a very cautious driver in general. Like basically saying all the things that I don't say when I'm actually in the car would be what I would do is like jump into like accidents do happen. Mm-hmm. Even when people are driving cautiously, accidents happen.
Well, I think this might be moving away a little bit from this, sticking to the strict kind of sequencing of the skill. But I feel like you're touching on really an existential kind of conundrum here, which is we are out of control or not in control of so many things in our life. So you could be the most cautious driver in the world and accidents do happen.
Right.
And so how do we live with that knowledge that anything really can happen at any time?
And again, this is a good example of my emotion of anger is not driven by the facts of how my husband is driving. It's driven by the fact of I am in a car out of control.
Yeah.
Like I cannot with certainty know whether an accident will happen or not.
Yeah.
And so radical acceptance, a skill that we've talked about before, is really like helpful here of like, rather than you're not doing it right, you need to drive in a different way to prevent more possibilities of something bad happening. Like accepting that something bad can happen.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what, something bad can happen.
Yes. So if we go with the skill where it says, imagine the catastrophe really happening. So you get in a car accident. How would you cope?
I mean, I would deal with it.
Yeah.
Whatever it might be. If I'm injured, I would deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I would deal with it. And I know I would kick into that gear pretty quickly.
Right.
And by checking the facts and slowing it down, I'm able to like really recognize like, oh, if an accident really happened, I would 100% put my energy into coping with that. Yes. And whatever that might mean.
Right. Which we can, and this is a metaphor, I think, for life, where accidents happen in all sorts of ways, where we don't want them and we're doing whatever we can to try to avoid them, or life just turns out, things happen that we wish they didn't happen, that we find ways to deal, we find ways to cope.
Right.
We lean on, other people.
Right.
Yeah.
We radically accept whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is where so often when we have intense emotions, it's because we're not accepting. We are not recognizing our ability to cope with even very, very painful, difficult things.
Yes. And people who are listening, I imagine, have had that experience where you have coped with coped with painful things. I mean, all of us have in one degree or another, and some lives have more suffering than others, unfortunately. But I imagine everyone who is listening can think back to times where they had to cope with really challenging things.
Yeah.
And they got through it one way or another.
Right. And reminding ourselves that we have that capacity. And for me, in this specific situation, it's like, oh, why am I so angry and frustrated and scared? Really, like what's underneath this fear?
Yes.
When like I feel very clear, if we had an accident, I would cope no matter what. I would find a way to cope.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it that I'm afraid of?
So this, as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so we said that the emotion was anger, and I can certainly relate because I've had this many times in the passenger position, and I have put my right foot out and press that brake in the passenger seat. And of course it never works, right? Yeah. Like it's automatically, it's sort of just I'm doing that. And that under that, and it comes out as anger.
Right.
You're going too fast, you're going too slow, whatever the other person is doing wrong. But underneath that is a lot of fear.
Right. That's it.
Yeah. And so the last question, does your emotion and or its intensity fit the actual facts of the situation?
So I would say anger does not fit the facts. Does intensity of anger, duration of anger, repetitiveness of anger does not fit the facts, right? And fear somewhat fits the facts. That it is, being in any kind of moving vehicle, there's potential for harm. So that somewhat fits the facts, but the intensity, the duration does not fit the facts.
Yeah. Another little nuance that we haven't really talked about is that sometimes the emotion fits the facts. And we'll talk about this more when we get into opposite action. So the emotion actually can fit the facts, but acting on it isn't effective.
Right.
So, and I think because I also have what I previously thought was a lot of anger in the passenger position when my significant other is driving, which now through the process we just went through, I think is also fear. Mm-hmm. I would say some degree of fear does fit the facts, but acting on it, being terrified every time I get in the car or every time I walk out of the house for that matter, or get in an airplane or do anything or just living in California where there's an increased risk of earthquakes,
right?
Feeling the fear of what could happen that we can't control on an everyday basis is not effective because it's paralyzing.
Right. So noticing, naming, working through is what can be most helpful. So checking the facts actually with some of these existential kind of feelings, checking the facts can be really valuable in and of itself.
Yes. And so we have this other skill called opposite action, which we'll talk about in our next episode. But the first place we go when you have an emotion, a painful emotion that you want to change, is to check the facts. And sometimes just doing that, and sometimes you don't even have to go to, am I assuming a threat? What's the catastrophe? How would I cope? Even just the first few questions of inquiring about the facts and trying to remove your interpretations and assumptions, that in and of itself can be enough to change the emotion and bring it down.
Right. So it's really valuable. I use this skill every single day in one way or another because it does help me to stay balanced. And if I'm having an emotion, to notice the emotion and not necessarily be overwhelmed by it.
Yes. So thank you so much, Ed, for working through Check the Facts with me.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to continuing with some of these emotional regulation skills.
Right. Because then the next thing we'll talk about, as I said, with opposite action is, okay, you can run through Check the Facts. Sometimes that is not enough to shift your emotion. So then what do you do? And we have more skills.
Yeah, more options.
There's more. Right. Okay, great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayarea.dbtcc.com. That's bayarea.dbtcc.com.